There's something about solo gaming that seems to make me more prone than usual to forgetting rules. Perhaps it's just the lack of other players to remind me, or the extent to which I like to immerse myself in the story of my game distracting me, but I'm far from the best when it comes to remembering rules interactions. That said, I think Final Girl's modular structure presents a unique challenge. It's only natural that after a few games you start to focus more on the rules that are specific for the feature film you are playing, and refer to the core rule set less and less. It appears I'm not alone in this. Having spent some time among the various groups and forums for the game, there are some common rules mistakes that players seem to make time and again. So in this video, I want to focus on those rules in a bit more detail and hopefully help you to remember these key mechanics in future. Whether you're a complete newcomer to Final Girl or just need a little refresh, here are 7 Final Girl core rules, at least one of which I reckon you will or have played wrong. We tend to think of rules errors as benefiting the player, but there's one mistake I see players make again and again that will definitely kill both your fun and your Final Girl. It may seem strange that the killer should stand still for a turn, often wasting an attack action as a consequence, but even if they are massively out of position in a location all by themselves, the killer will still not move unless there is a foot-shaped move icon as part of their action, with the exception of some cards that will tell you to move the killer to a specific location rather than to take a move action. In fact, the majority of killers in Season 1 do not have movement as part of their basic action each turn. They'll happily take a swipe at something in their area, but are less likely to hunt targets down, at least until you draw their terror card. If you allow the killer to move regardless, you will find yourself watching this feature film on high speed, and you won't like how it ends. On the other end of the advantage scale is a key part of the rule for escorting victims across the map. Even if your Final Girl is the most callous heroine known to man, you cannot escort victims into the same space as the killer, whether temporarily or to act as your personal meat shield. Let's not imbue the victims with too much intelligence in a game where victims can't even stand next to a window without risking dying horribly, but with the most basic sense they were born with, they will refuse to follow your Final Girl into the killer's space. This includes instances where the killer might be standing on or between you and an exit space, preventing you from saving victims via that route. There are exceptions to this rule. Certain events will allow you to bring victims into the killer's space, or otherwise encourage their movement in a way that might result in such an outcome. Somewhat obviously, victims will also normally be very happy to follow the Final Girl away from the killer's space if they are already there. But barring a specific rule to the contrary, if the killer is in your path, you will have to find an alternative route, or simply go it alone. Hey, those victims were probably slowing you down anyway. In theory, the killer's targeting rules are quite straightforward, but because they come with overlapping priorities and exceptions, it's a part of the rulebook that can momentarily confuse even the most attentive of players. So let's break targeting down into 3 easy steps. First, the killer's target for a given action is determined by one of 3 symbols. This symbol means that they would target a victim, remembering that the Final Girl is never a victim. This one conversely means that the Final Girl will be targeted. Lastly, this symbol means that the killer will happily target a victim or a Final Girl, whichever is closer, but the killer will always prioritise a victim unless the Final Girl is closer. Often there will be multiple targets that could be chosen. Our second step is to remember that the killer will always head towards the closest target. However, this does not include the target type not chosen during step 1. This means that the killer can and will move through a space containing the Final Girl to get to a victim if they are specifically targeting victims at the time, perhaps ending up in a space on the board with no viable targets to attack if they can't reach their intended victim. Lastly, if the killer is targeting victims and there are multiple equidistant spaces containing victims, the killer will move towards the space containing the most victims. If there's still a tie, the normal ambiguity rules of the game kick in, with you selecting the option that is the funniest, the most realistic or thematic, or, as is my usual approach, the option that is simply the worst for you. Personally, if I still can't decide, I will use a dice roll to break ties, but this is pretty rare. One point to note, however, is that a killer resolving an attack action will still attack a type of target in their area even if they had moved towards something different in the first place. No sense in wasting the opportunity after all. So for example, if the killer is targeting victims, but getting to the nearest victim results in them ending their movement in a space that contains only the Final Girl, well, let's just say that guard card is going to come in handy sooner than you thought. Searching for weapons to use against the killer, augmenting your attacks with extra damage, is one of the most fun parts of Final Girl, so it's perhaps surprising how many players appear to have forgotten or misunderstood a key aspect of weapon use: how they affect reactions. Essentially, a weapon with the appropriate statistics can normally be combined with any action card that does damage, not just your attack cards. This includes reactions. While a guard card will not benefit from weapons damage as it does not deal damage itself, anytime you use a Retaliate card you absolutely can and should utilise the additional damage of a weapon you may be carrying. After all, if your final girl is wielding a knife, they're hardly going to forget to use it when in the clutches of the killer. The usual exceptions to weapons use still apply, of course. Ranged weapons won't be used in this way as you will not meet the range requirements for their use when being attacked by the killer. Additionally, some weapons can specifically only be used in conjunction with particular cards, such as weak attack, or cannot be used in combination with action cards at all. But that still leaves a veritable armoury of items in the game that are just as useful in defence as they are in attack. Tanking the odd hit from the killer at the perfect moment, turning their attack into your attack, is a viable strategy in a number of feature films, so make sure that when you do so, that you are getting the absolute most out of what is, after all, a relatively expensive action card. If you've played a few games of Final Girl, you will probably already understand the time mechanic requires careful balance to ensure that you can both take the actions you want to take in a given turn and have enough time left over to buy important action cards for the following turn. Despite this, it's easy to forget that you can also discard action cards in exchange for additional time at any point during the action phase. Each card discarded in this way will grant you one extra point of time, which can then either be used within the current action phase or to boost your buying power when purchasing cards in the planning phase. This is a rule that's easily overlooked even by more experienced players, but it can be a critical bonus to your efforts to win the game. Obviously, it can be useful to have the odd card you don't really need in order to upgrade dice results of 3 or 4, so timing is everything. However, it's worth remembering that this rule even applies to zero cost cards that will return to your hand the turn after next for free. So if you're nearing the end of your turn and you're sure you're not going to need that short rest card during the next action phase, maybe you have nothing to lose from trading the card in. It is important to note that you must utilise this rule prior to the end of the action phase. You cannot therefore use it to increase the amount of time you have going into the following action phase. However, as one of the few rules that make your survival easier, it's definitely worth getting into the habit of checking your hand just before you end your action phase to see whether you're holding any loose change. Final Girl is a game that forces you to push your luck and take bold decisions at the very moments that success is critical. It's one of the things that makes the narrative of a game of Final Girl so compelling, and the adrenaline rush rule is one way in which the game tries to create these moments. Most players seem to cope with half of this rule just fine. In the event your Final Girl is reduced to the final health token before her death, you immediately acquire an additional dice for your future horror rolls, greatly increasing your chance of success and forcing you to decide whether it's worth healing, and therefore losing this benefit, or whether to keep pushing your luck on 1 point of health. But Adrenaline Rush also applies when the killer is on their final health token. Bring the killer this close to death, and in addition to the adrenaline that will no doubt be rushing through your own veins, you will have an additional dice to help you finish them off. It's not necessarily likely, but if both the killer and the final girl are down to their final health token, you will get 2 extra dice for every horror roll. So the next time you feel like all hope is lost, whether for you or your pig mask wearing adversary, be sure to double check that you are not missing the chance to boost your success. Final Girl is a game finely tuned for difficulty, and as such it's probably not surprising that some games will come down to a last gasp attack. It is important to remember in such moments that your single win condition, unless otherwise stated by the feature film rules, is to defeat the killer. In the unusual but possible scenario that the action that kills the killer also kills your final girl, you have still won the game. The final girl has sold her life for the greater good, and in that there can be no shame. There are feature films that mess with this possibility a little. Against the Poltergeist, your objective is not to kill the already very dead killer, so this rule will never apply. Likewise, the rules for the USS Conrad make it clear that if you choose to attempt to win the game by blowing up the ship, this will only count as a victory if your final girl also makes it to the escape pod in time. However, in most circumstances, if you can take the killer down, this is a victory whether or not you are still standing thereafter. On the upside, unlike most of the rules we've discussed in this video, if you suddenly remember it walking down the street a week later, the worst you'll have suffered is to have won a game you thought you had lost. There is one golden rule that applies to all board games. At the end of the day, the rules are not as important as having fun. I'm not the rules police, and if you prefer to play the game with a few house rules or the odd mechanic left out, all power to you. That said, it's also true that the satisfaction you experience defeating a Final Girl game can end up feeling a little hollow if you realise days later that you kind of cheated a bit. I hope this video will help you internalise these easily forgotten rules. Please let us know in the comments if you have overlooked these rules yourself and what other mistakes you may have made in your own playthroughs of Final Girl. What effect did they have? Did you end up making Hans look like a little piglet? Or did your mistakes give Inkanyamba even more supernatural power than he was due? One thing is for sure, you won't be the only one. If this video helped you, please give us a like to keep the old algorithm happy, and let us know what Final Girl videos you would most like to see from us. Don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss our future content. We'll be back soon, but until then, remember to work hard, play better, and take care out there.